I'm Susan Hodge Irwin, born and raised in this church. My work on the Archives Committee includes researching the 13 individuals on the Founder's Plaque in the vestibule of the church. These were the 13 communicants at the time the church was formally accepted into the Episcopal fold in February 1848. 7 were vestry members, and some had been involved in the organization of the congregation when services were held as early as 1840. This will be a brief overview in 3 parts, and there's so much information here, I'll be referring to my notes. First, let's go over 6 names. Dr. W.C. Bennett was a dentist, born in Syracuse, New York. Joseph M. Elford was a merchant, a close friend of the Reverend John DeWitt McCullough, and served as longtime clerk of the vestry and Sunday school superintendent. Major James Henry donated land on nearby Henry Street for the first church. Miss Catherine Hood, a teacher, in 1850 was living in the household of Dr. and Mrs. Maurice A. Moore, and later she relocated to Glen Springs. George Washington Hamilton Legg, along with Dr. Bennett, the dentist, oversaw the construction of the current church building. His marriage to Clementina Kennedy, sister of Dr. L.C. Kennedy, was the first recorded marriage in the church. And he was the first to be buried in the churchyard after the current building was completed. There was a parishioner who asked to be buried during the construction period, and her request was fulfilled. And then we have Colonel Henry Hobson Thompson. He served on both the 1843 and 1848 vestry and served as a representative in the South Carolina State Legislature. The next names are people buried behind me where I'm standing. David Reinhardt, Miss Catherine Reinhardt, who may be his sister, William Irwin, and Mrs. Amelia Irwin. They are all buried on the north side of the church, not far from the grave of the Reverend John DeWitt McCullough, architect of the church and its second rector. And Dr. McCullough is buried here. And this is William Irwin here. David Reinhardt came to Upper South Carolina from Lincolnton, North Carolina. By this time, his wife, Margaret Alexander, was deceased. Their 3 daughters were married, and his son, a Harvard graduate, was with the Army in Oklahoma. His surviving account books show that he was a freight forwarder for the railroad. David Reinhardt's daughter, Amelia, had married William Irwin in 1845 in Greenville at the home of her relative, Mrs. Vardry Macbee. William Irwin, whose grave marker is here, was born in Ireland, earned his degree from Trinity College Dublin, a Protestant institution, and came to America about 1839, coming through New York. He was a teacher in Fincastle, Virginia, before coming to Upper South Carolina, where he helped establish Christ Church in Greenville, co-owned a hotel, and was a teacher. In 1845, he married Amelia Reinhardt, and by 1848 had attained full American citizenship, a 5-year process. He established himself in Spartanburg, running the Male Academy with Dr. McCullough and teaching Latin and Greek at what became St. John's College on 83 acres, now the site of Converse College. When the school was recast as a military academy, he continued to teach until all the students had gone off to the Civil War. Before his full-time appointment as rector, the Reverend McCullough kept notes on his travels. detailing trips to preach in the Carolinas and Virginia. Among his destinations were Fincastle, Virginia, and Lincolnton, North Carolina. This presents compelling evidence that these two church founders were probably attracted to Upper South Carolina through an association with Dr. John DeWitt McCullough, who was said to be an eloquent preacher. The union of these two founders leaves 16 descendants buried in the churchyard, some on each side of the church. And the final part of the founder's story concerns the Kennedy family from Charleston. Dr. Elsie Kennedy, Mrs. Helen Kennedy, and Miss Mary Kennedy, Dr. Kennedy's mother. Dr. Kennedy's parents were Major Lionel Henry Kennedy, a graduate of Yale who returned to practice law in Charleston, and Mary Ann Jane Stevens. Dr. Lionel Chalmers Kennedy served in the Confederate Army as a surgeon and was the first president of the Spartanburg County Medical Society. His signature can be seen in their first account book of 1871 in the Medical Society's archives in the library at USC Upstate. His wife, Helen Fasu Stevens of Charleston, was one of 7 children born to Clement Stevens and Sarah Johnson Fasu. Her father owned a sugar plantation in Jamaica and came to Florida and then to Charleston. Helen's maternal grandfather was Dr. Peter Fasu, renowned surgeon in the American War for Independence. Dr. and Mrs. Kennedy were active in the church and the community until their deaths. They had no children. So after her death in 1894, their estate established the Kennedy Free Library, now our Spartanburg Public Library, where the local history research section, the Kennedy Room, honors their legacy. What a blessing they were to this community. Their graves may be seen along Kennedy Street, just south of the church. This has been just a brief overview. There's so much more to tell in this story. Special thanks to the Research Library at UNC Chapel Hill, to volunteer Dora Pocock at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland, to Todd Stevens of the Public Library and the Kennedy Room staff, to members of the Church Archives Committee, and Irwin family members who have preserved lots of documents, and also to Dr. John Edmonds, the late Dr. Edmonds, professor of history at USC Upstate, who put together History and Records, 1848 to 1998, chock full of interesting information. And so for the work of these early founders to establish this church and spread the gospel through worship and good works, we may say, thanks be to God.